Good morning. My name is Kevin Tincher. Today we're going to be talking about the basics of wilderness survival. We call them the sacred four or the four elements of survival. And there's another fifth element that we'll talk about in a little while. But today we're going to start with the basics. So the basics of wilderness survival involve shelter, water, fire, and food in that order. That's the reason we call it the sacred order. So the first element being shelter usually involves whatever you have wearing on your body is your first line of defense when it comes to the elements, because what you're trying to defend against is hyperthermia or hypothermia, which means you're either too hot or too cold, which causes your body to shut down. So let's say we're in a situation where we're trapped on an island, like the character in the book that you guys are reading, and she has to make her own clothing. Probably she has to find shelter. So basic shelter, like I said, involves your clothing. So native people all over the world used animal skins. This is an animal skin that's been tanned, it's been bark tanned. It's kind of still stiff, so it still needs a little more processing. This is a deer hide that's been processed all the way down. It's been smoked, brain tanned, so it's ready to make some clothing out of. So in a survival situation, you probably are not going to be able to go that in depth right off the bat. So the next element of shelter would be your shelter that you would have to build. Because if you don't have proper clothing on and you're wet and you're cold or you're really, really hot and you can't find any way to cool off, your shelter then becomes your next element. So building a shelter that maintains your body heat, either from getting too hot or too cold, is super critical in a survival situation. So you want to maintain that 98.6 that we have within us all the time. So if it get too hot, you get hyperthermia. Too cold, you get hypothermia. So there's different kinds of shelters, and it depends on the landscape that you're in. Because if you're on a desert island, obviously it's going to be a different type of shelter than if you're in the woodlands like we live here in North Carolina. So you have to know what's available, what kind of materials are available, so that you can make a shelter. The basic shelter that we build a lot of times in survival school is called a debris hut. Basically, it's a structure, kind of like a small teepee structure that you cover with insulated materials. You crawl inside of it, you fill it up completely. It's like a little miniature sleeping bag about this big, made out of sticks and leaves. Those have been tested to about 40 below zero if you build them correctly. If they're about 4 to 5 feet thick and you're completely stuffed on the inside, you can survive about 40 below zero if you know what you're doing and how to build it. There's a lot of tricks to it. We won't go that much in depth to it today, but I just wanted to go over how shelter is just like your body. Whatever clothes you have on is what your basic line of survival is. So if you have on cotton, which we call death cloth, it's not very good if you get wet, because cotton does not maintain your body heat. So we'll go more into shelter a little bit more when it comes into the fifth element. So the second element is water. Water is super critical to our survival. We can only go about 3 days before our body starts shutting down. So if we look at the four elements of survival, we can go about 4 hours without proper shelter before our body starts shutting down if we're too hot or too cold. We can go about 3 to 4 days without water before our body starts shutting down. We might die at that point. And then we can go about 3 to 4 weeks without food. Now, a lot of people think as soon as they get into a survival situation, oh, I got to find some food right away, I'm going to starve to death. But like I said, you got about 3 to 4 weeks before you actually starve to death. And you might not even be dead at that point. You'll just be incapacitated where you can't actually move around and do anything. So the second element is water. So we had to figure out a way to find water, make water, incorporate water so that our body does not be shut down. Now, here in the Appalachians, we have lots of access to water. We just had to find out how to actually find the proper water or how to treat it. Most times in a survival situation, we'll collect water and we'll boil the water, which I'll go over that in a second. A lot of times what we'll do, we'll find a small little spring and we'll follow it uphill to where it's coming out of the ground, and then we'll circle around about 100 yards around that spring, make sure there's no dead animals or anything laying in it like chemicals or anything like that, and we're able to drink that water right out of the ground. Now, in a desert island situation, you're going to be dependent on rainfall or springs that might be on the water. Sometimes there are water sources on a desert island. In a jungle, you have plants that hold water. You get a lot of rainfall, so there are ways to collect water off the landscape. Rainfall is 99% safe unless you're next to a city, downwind of a city, so you're picking up chemicals in your rainfall. So rainfall is super critical. Now let's go around to the next element, which is fire. So in a survival situation, fire becomes one of your main resources. This is a hand drill. This is the oldest known way to make fire. Traditionally, fire was made, we would collect it thousands and thousands of years ago before we learned how to make fire. We would actually just collect it. So when a lightning strike would hit and there'd be a forest fire, they would get some embers from the fire and they would carry it around with them for weeks at a time, because carrying the fire with you enabled them to have it all the time. And then once we learned how to make fire with a hand drill or a bow drill, then we were able to make fire whenever we could go out in the elements. We could carry our fire kit with us. We could make fire wherever we were at. Now, the most important thing about fire, and I'll show you one of the containers, which this is a fire burn container. So this is a bowl that was fire burned. I'm collecting some chaga in it, which is a type of fungus. It's good for fire making and good for tea and medicine. So if you don't have a way to cook your water, what you have to do is you have to burn a bowl. So this would be like if you want to purify water, or if you wanted to actually cook in it, you would fill your bowl up with water and you would take hot rocks, because you can't sit your wooden bowl right over top of the fire. You take hot rocks and you put them in there, and the water will boil and it will cook your soup. So you just keep replacing the rocks with more hot ones. When those cool off, you take those out, put more hot ones in there. And that will actually cook your food and boil your water, because you need to boil your water like a good 10 minutes to be able to drink it if it's collected from a source that you don't know about. So fire becomes a way to make tools. Same way with making the spoons and stuff. So the spoons are made, we take a little coal from the fire, we place on there, we burn it in, then we scrape it out. Same way we made the bowl. So fire becomes your friend, because not only does it protect you from the elements, it can also protect you from the animals. And you also need a way to cook. So if you have an animal that you happen to have killed, which we'll go into next, you'll actually have a way to cook the animal, because you can't eat most animals raw. So fire becomes your friend because it makes tools, it allows you to cook, it allows you to do all this kind of stuff that you can't do without fire. So learning how to make fire or carry fire is super critical. Now let's go on to our next element a little bit, which is hunting. So hunting in the book was quite important, because you learn how to make a bow and arrow. And this is a homemade bow. This is a hickory bow made out of hickory wood. Actually, it's white oak. White oak. Then this is sinew, which we'll go into in a minute. It's a sinew string. And then these are some spear tips and some arrows. So the arrows are made, collected feathers, use the sinew to fletch them. These have modern tips on them, which are steel tips, but this one's made to incorporate an arrowhead. So so eventually we can have this little thing here. We make the arrowheads. We lash them on here with either tree sap or with lashings like sinew. And then if we happen to break it off, it gets broken, we still have our arrow. So this is a traditional form of way to make your arrowheads and put them on there. You always have your arrow that's never going to break, which is locally sourced river cane. And then we insert it in there and we can carry it with us. We can change our heads out and stuff. So these are all locally sourced arrows. This is some oak right here. These two are cane, river cane. So then another element that she used in the book that we could also use is making spear points. So these would be pulled together a little bit more and lashed, and then as she's out stalking for the fish, stabs it into the fish, kills it. The barbs that I carved into it will hold the fish. So once you get to this point, you fire harden it a little bit. You either hold it high over the fire to harden it, like this one you can see, or you stick it in the sand next to the fire, and that fire hardens the tips, so that when you actually kill something, it doesn't just break off your tips. Because if you just carve it out of wood and it hits a rock, it's just going to turn to splinters. It's not going to break, but it'll just turn to splinters. So these are examples of traditional made spear points. Now we would take a stick and we would notch it in order to hold the notch on the spear tip. And if you're fishing, you would tie a string around it and tie a string onto your stick, so that when you stab the fish, he swims off with your spear point, but you still got him on your string on your spear, and you pick him up like that. So these are traditional made spear points. You can make them out of all kinds of stuff. Now on a desert island, a lot of times they would not have sticks to make arrows or points like that. So this is a bone arrow point or a bone spear point that I took off a deer bone, carved it up. It's got some nice little notches in it and stuff. So this would be inserted onto your spear tip as well. Stabbed it into the animal, fishing with it. So hunting becomes a very critical aspect because you got to have food when you're out in a survival situation. So you can go 3 to 4 weeks, but at that 3-week mark, you're pretty incapacitated. So you have to learn how to take animals. So there's all kinds of ways between fishing, hunting. Here's another spear point, by the way. This one was split, other than those. Look at these right here. These were already naturally formed from the stick grew this way. This one was a single stick that I split down the middle. I put the sticks in it and I wrapped it, and then I fire hardened it. So this was a single solid stick that was made into a spear point as well. So hunting becomes very critical because you need tools from hunting. Not only do you need the food, you need the tools, the bones that you can use for tools. This is an awl for sewing. You also can extract sinew, which I think she did in the book. This is sinew, which is part of the deer. This is deer sinew. All animals have sinew in them. So this is the strongest natural material on the planet. Because between every bone and along your back, there's a little stitch of sinew. And along your back or your legs, you have all the way from your ankle up to your hip is a solid piece of sinew. So hunters would extract the sinew to use on for sewing. They would use it to lash their materials together, all that fun kind of stuff. And so our 4 elements, shelter, water, fire, and food, we have to acquire them off the landscape. Everything has to be found in the woods or whatever landscape we're on in order to survive. And then the final element is the 5th element, which I think is almost as critical as knowing how all these things work together, is your attitude. Because in the book, she could have given up after her brother died, but she didn't. Her attitude allowed her to want to survive for her own internal reasons. So if you're in a survival situation, you have to find the internal awareness, the internal strength to want to survive the situation, whether it's for your family or your spouse or your children. You're trapped in the woods for an extended period of time. Your attitude of, I'm just going to lay down here and die, or I'm not going to build a shelter, that's not going to allow you to survive. You have to have an internal motivation and attitude to want to survive a situation. Because in a lot of situations, children have been found alive because they are willing to crawl inside of a log that's full of bugs and is nasty, but they survive because they found a shelter. Whereas us adults, we might look at that same log and say, I'm not crawling in there. And they'll sit down on the log and they'll die because of hypothermia. So your attitude is actually your most critical element when it comes to survival. So I hope that clears up some of the misconceptions you guys have heard. I hope that gives you a little insight in what the character Corona had to go through in the book. And thank you for listening.